The big hall was filled with bright lights and the sound of people laughing and talking. It was a very important night for the city, a charity gala where the richest people came to show off their money and their expensive clothes. The air smelled like expensive perfume and fresh flowers. Outside, it was cold and raining, but inside, it was warm and golden. Everyone looked perfect. The men wore dark, shiny suits that probably cost more than a car, and the women wore long dresses that sparkled under the lights. They held glasses of champagne and talked loudly about their vacations and their big houses. In the middle of all this richness sat a large black piano. It looked like a shiny beast waiting for someone to tame it. But the person who was going to play it was hiding in the shadows behind the heavy red curtains. Her name was Elena. She was not rich, and she was not famous. She was just a music teacher who loved music more than anything else in the world. She had practiced on old, broken pianos in small rooms for most of her life. Tonight, she was the last-minute replacement. The famous pianist who was supposed to play had gotten sick, and somehow, Elena's name was pulled from a list of substitutes. When Elena looked down at herself, she felt a wave of shyness wash over her. Her dress was simple blue cotton. It didn't sparkle, and it didn't have a famous brand name on it. She had bought it years ago for a different kind of event. While everyone else looked like movie stars, she looked like she was going to a library. She felt very small. She held her sheet music in her hands. The papers were yellow and a bit crinkled at the edges because she had used them for so long. To her, these papers were gold, but to anyone else, they just looked old. Behind the curtain, she could hear the crowd. They were not quiet. "Who is playing next?" a man's voice boomed. "I heard they had to find someone at the last minute," a woman replied with a laugh that sounded mean. "Let's hope they can actually play. I don't want to fall asleep in my chair." Another voice chimed in, probably just some student. "I need another drink." Elena felt a sting in her heart. She knew she didn't belong there in terms of money or status, but she belonged there in terms of skill. She knew she could play. She had spent her whole life trying to make the piano sing. But hearing them laugh without even seeing her made her legs feel weak. She took a deep breath to calm the butterflies in her stomach. She closed her eyes for a second and imagined she was back in her small, cozy apartment, just playing for herself. The music was the only thing that mattered, she told herself. Not the dresses, not the money, just the music. Suddenly, the lights on the stage changed. The purple and blue lights faded to a bright white, shining right on the piano. A man in a fancy tuxedo walked up to the microphone. He tapped on it, making a loud thumping sound that echoed through the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, but his voice sounded bored, like he had said this 100 times tonight. "For our final performance of the evening, we have a special guest. Please welcome to the stage, Elena." He stumbled a little over her name, making it sound weird and foreign. A few people in the front row giggled. It wasn't a nice giggle. It was the kind of laugh people make when they think something is below them. They looked at the curtain, expecting someone to come out and make a fool of themselves. They were ready to be bored. They were ready to make fun of the unknown player who dared to take the stage in a room full of kings and queens. Elena opened her eyes. This was it. There was no turning back. She smoothed the front of her simple blue dress with her shaking hands. She didn't look like a star. She looked like a normal person who had gotten lost on her way to the grocery store. But as she took her first step out from the safety of the curtain, she stopped looking at the floor. She lifted her chin. She might look simple, but she carried a fire inside her that these people would never understand. The bright spotlight hit her face, blinding her for a moment. She couldn't see the crowd clearly, but she could feel them. It felt like a heavy wall of judgment. As she walked across the stage, her shoes made soft clicking sounds on the wood. The walk felt like it took forever, even though it was only a few seconds. She could feel hundreds of eyes burning into her. She saw the flashes of cameras taking pictures of the rich people in the front row, but no one took a picture of her. She was invisible to them, or worse, she was a joke. She reached the piano bench. It was black and shiny. She sat down gently. The bench was cold. The piano loomed over her, huge and intimidating. For a second, she felt like a little girl again, scared of the big instrument. But then she placed her fingers on the keys. The ivory felt cool and familiar. It felt like coming home. She adjusted the bench, wiggling it a bit to get comfortable. From her seat, she could see the first row clearly now. A man with a thick gold watch was looking at his phone, ignoring her completely. A woman in a diamond necklace was whispering to her neighbor, rolling her eyes toward Elena. They had already decided she wasn't worth their time. The atmosphere was loud and rude. People were still clinking glasses and shuffling in their seats. The noise was annoying, like a buzz of flies that wouldn't go away. Elena took another deep breath. She looked at her old, crinkled sheet music one last time. She didn't really need it, she knew every note by heart, but it gave her comfort. She could feel her heart beating fast against her ribs. Thump, thump, thump. She prayed her hands wouldn't shake too much. She knew that if she played just one wrong note, the crowd would pounce on it. They were waiting for her to fail. She flexed her fingers. She thought about the song she was going to play. It was a piece that started very quietly, almost like a whisper. It was a song about sadness and hope, things that everyone in the room seemed to have forgotten about in their fancy lives. She blocked out the man with the gold watch. She ignored the woman with the diamonds. She stopped hearing the mean whispers. The world narrowed down until there was only her and the black and white keys in front of her. The room was loud, rude, and mocking, but Elena was ready. She was about to show them that you don't need a diamond necklace to shine. She took a final breath, steadied her shoulders, and lifted her hands to begin. The silence that followed the introduction was not a respectful silence. It was an empty, noisy kind of quiet where people whispered to their neighbors and checked their phones. The man with the microphone had walked off the stage quickly, eager to get back to his own drink. He had mumbled Elena's last name, turning it into a joke before she had even played a single note. She sat there on the bench, feeling very small and very alone. The heavy velvet curtains behind her were the only things keeping her hidden from the world outside this room, but here, under the bright lights, she felt like she was standing naked in front of a crowd of wolves. Elena shifted on the bench. The leather creaked softly. In a quiet concert hall, that little squeak would have been heard by everyone. But here, with the noise of the crowd, nobody noticed. They were too busy talking. A man in the front row, wearing a tuxedo that looked very expensive, was loudly telling a story about a golf game. The woman next to him was nodding politely, but her eyes were drifting around the room, looking for someone more important to talk to. Neither of them was looking at Elena. To them, she was just a part of the furniture, like the potted plants or the heavy curtains. She was the background noise while they ate their dinner. Elena placed her feet on the pedals. She felt the cold metal against her shoes. She took a long, slow breath, filling her lungs with air that smelled of expensive food and too much perfume. She tried to push the smells and the sounds out of her mind. She had to create a wall. Inside that wall, there was only the music. Outside the wall, there were people laughing at her dress, people ignoring her, and people wishing she would hurry up so the band could come back and play loud jazz music. She raised her hands. Her fingers looked thin and pale compared to the shiny black keys. For a second, she hesitated. The fear gripped her throat like a tight hand. What if they are right, she thought. What if I am just a simple teacher who doesn't belong here? But then she remembered the hours she spent practicing. She remembered the feeling of the music when it was right, when it felt like flying. She wasn't playing to impress them. She was playing because she had to. The music was inside her, and it needed to come out. She pressed down the first key. It was a soft note, a gentle C note in the middle of the piano. It was not loud. It did not crash or boom. It was just a single, clear sound that rang out like a small bell in the distance. Because the room was so noisy, many people did not even hear it. The man talking about golf continued his story. The glasses kept clinking. The waiters kept rushing around with silver trays. To most of the room, the performance had not even started yet. Elena did not rush. She let that note fade away until the sound was gone completely. Then, she played another note. And then another. She was playing the introduction to the piece, a very slow and simple melody. It was not showy. It did not require fast fingers or giant jumps across the keyboard. It was just a tune, sweet and sad, like a lullaby. A few people near the front who were actually listening turned their heads. They looked confused. "Is this the song?" one man whispered loudly to his wife. "It sounds like a child's practice lesson." His wife covered her mouth to hide a giggle. They were used to big, dramatic starts. They wanted the pianist to attack the piano, to show off power and strength. Elena was doing the opposite. She was barely touching the keys, teasing a quiet melody out of them. The mocking got worse. A group of young people standing in the back, who had probably come just for the free drinks, started to laugh. "Hey, I can play that," one of them said, loud enough for the people around him to hear. "My little sister plays better than that on her toy keyboard." The group laughed, their voices sharp and cutting. Elena's face felt hot. She could hear them. Even with her eyes closed, she could feel their laughter hitting her. But she did not stop. She did not speed up to try to impress them. She kept the slow, steady pace. She let the melody flow. It was a humble beginning, just like her. It wasn't trying to be fancy. It was just trying to be true. As she continued to play, the notes began to connect. The simple melody started to grow. It was like a small stream that was slowly getting wider. The sound of the piano was beautiful, even if it was quiet. The instrument itself was a masterpiece, and even a gentle touch made it sing with a rich, warm tone. A waiter walked past the front row, carrying a tray full of full champagne glasses. He was moving fast, trying to clear the table before the next course. As he passed the piano, something strange happened. He slowed down. He had walked past many musicians tonight, barely hearing them over the noise of his job. But this sound, it made him pause. He stopped for just a second, right next to a heavy marble pillar. He looked at the woman in the simple blue dress. He couldn't see her face well because of the bright lights in his eyes, but he could hear the sadness in her playing. It reminded him of something, maybe a song from his childhood, or just a feeling of being tired after a long day. He stood there for a moment, holding the heavy tray, just listening. The crowd, however, was still mostly oblivious. The noise level in the room had dipped slightly, but only because people were curious why the music was so soft. They were waiting for the real music to start. "Is she just tuning it?" a woman asked, annoyance in her voice. "When is the crescendo? I'm bored." Elena's fingers moved across the keys. She was playing a series of chords now, low and deep. The sound was starting to fill the bottom of the room. It vibrated in the floor. If they had been quiet, they would have felt the music in their feet. But they were still shifting in their seats, still rattling their jewelry. She knew she had to be patient. The music was a story. You cannot rush a story. You have to set the scene. You have to introduce the characters. The beginning of this song was about loneliness. It was about standing alone in a big, scary place. That was how Elena felt right now. She poured that feeling into the keys. She played the notes with a touch that was so gentle, it was like she was afraid of hurting the piano. The contrast was painful. On the stage, there was a moment of pure, honest emotion. In the audience, there was a sea of fake smiles, greedy eyes, and bored expressions. The rich people were trapped in their own little bubbles of money and ego. They couldn't see the human being sitting right in front of them. They only saw what they wanted to see: a nobody, a waste of their time. Elena hit a slightly more complex run of notes. It was a trickle of sound, like rain falling on a roof. It was beautiful, but it was still quiet. A few more people stopped talking. Not many, maybe just 10 or 20 in the whole room. They frowned, looking at the stage. They sensed that something was different. The woman playing wasn't shaking anymore. She wasn't looking at the crowd with fear. Her eyes were closed, her head was tilted slightly to the side, and she looked like she was in a trance. One of the critics in the back, a man who wrote reviews for the newspaper, put down his pen. He had come ready to write a bad review. He had decided before she even started that this substitute would be terrible. But as he listened to the quiet rain of notes, he felt his pen stop. He couldn't write yet. It didn't sound like a beginner. It didn't sound like a student. The timing was too perfect. The feeling was too deep. He leaned forward, squinting his eyes to see her hands better. But the room was still mostly rude. The laughter from the back row had stopped, replaced by loud whispering. "I think she is only playing the easy part," a voice sneered. "She probably can't play the fast part." They were still underestimating her. They were still mocking her humble start. Elena's hands moved further apart on the keyboard. The left hand played a deep, steady rhythm, while the right hand played a melody that started to climb higher. The music was growing. It was waking up, just like Elena was waking up. The fear was leaving her body, flowing out through her fingers and into the piano. The more she played, the stronger she felt. The simple blue dress didn't matter. The dirty looks didn't matter. She had the power, and she was about to show them what that power looked like. The room was loud, the people were mean, but the music was getting ready to fight back. The first few notes that came out of the piano were so soft that they almost didn't exist. They were like a whisper in a loud library. To the people in the back of the room, it sounded like nothing was happening. A man near the bar, who was shouting for another drink, didn't even stop talking. The sound of his voice was much louder than Elena's music. In the front row, the woman with the sparkling diamond necklace looked at her fingernails, looking bored. She tapped her foot on the floor, waiting for the music to get loud or for the performance to be over so she could go back to talking about her new car. The melody Elena played was simple. It was just a few notes going up and down, like a child climbing a few steps and then coming back down. Because it was so simple, the people who were listening thought it was a mistake. They thought she was just warming up her fingers. "Is she tuning the piano?" a young man whispered loudly to his friend. He laughed a little. "I thought this was the performance, not the sound check." His friend giggled into her hand. "Maybe she forgot the song. She looks nervous. Look at her hands." They were right about one thing. Elena's hands looked delicate and fragile on the big keys. But they were wrong about the music. Even though the notes were simple, the way she played them was not. It wasn't just a scale, it was a question. It was a feeling of wondering what was going to happen next. The sound was clear and pure, cutting through the thick air of the room like a knife through hot butter. But you had to be listening closely to hear it. Most people were not listening closely. They were busy being rich and important. The noise in the hall was a wall of sound, clinking silverware, laughing, and the low hum of hundreds of voices. It seemed like Elena's music was going to be drowned out completely. She was fighting a losing battle against a room full of people who didn't care. But then, something changed in the music. Elena's right hand stopped playing the simple up and down notes. It started to move a little faster. The melody began to twist and turn. It wasn't a straight line anymore. It was like a small stream that had hit some rocks and started to splash. The notes became sadder, deeper. They rang out with a vibration that you could feel in your chest if you were paying attention. Near the stage, a waiter was standing perfectly still. He was a young man with a tired face, holding a heavy silver tray full of dirty glasses. He was waiting for a break in the conversation so he could clear the table next to him. Usually, when the music played, he just ignored it. It was just background noise, like the air conditioning. But this sound made him stop. He looked over at the piano. He couldn't see Elena's face because of the glare of the lights, but he could hear the difference. The notes weren't just hitting the right spots, they were connecting. It sounded like someone was telling a secret without using words. The waiter forgot about his tray. He forgot about the dirty dishes. He just stood there, his mouth slightly open, listening to the sad, quiet song. Slowly, very slowly, the mood around the piano began to shift. It started with the people closest to the front. They couldn't ignore it anymore because the music was starting to weave its way into their conversations. A woman was telling a story about a yacht, but she found herself trailing off. The music was interrupting her thoughts. It was pulling at her attention. The melody grew a little louder. Elena pressed the keys with more confidence. She wasn't tapping them anymore, she was pushing into them. The sound coming from the piano was rich and full. It sounded expensive, much more expensive than the jewelry the women were wearing. It was a sound that demanded respect, but it did it gently. It didn't scream for attention, it just asked for it. The mocking laughter from the back row didn't stop all at once. It faded away slowly, like a flashlight running out of battery. The people who were making fun of her started to feel uncomfortable. They realized that the joke might be on them. This woman wasn't playing chopsticks. She was playing something real. Something that actually sounded good. One of the critics, a man who had seen thousands of concerts, put down his phone. He had been scrolling through emails, completely ignoring the stage. But the sound of a particular chord, something complex and unexpected, made his head snap up. He looked at Elena with narrowed eyes. He was surprised. He looked at the program in his hand, which had her name typed simply on it. He tried to match the simple, humble music with the sophisticated sounds he was hearing. It didn't make sense to him. How could someone dressed so plainly, looking so nervous, play with such control? The room was still noisy, but the noise was changing. People weren't laughing as much. They were starting to whisper. The whispers weren't mean anymore, they were confused. "Listen," a man whispered to his wife. "Just listen for a second." The wife stopped fanning herself with her napkin. She turned her head toward the stage. Her annoyed expression softened. She heard the melody climbing higher, getting faster. It was like a bird taking flight. It was beautiful in a way that she hadn't expected. She had come expecting a boring show, maybe a clumsy student. But this was professional. This was art. Elena felt the change in the air. She couldn't see the faces clearly because of the spotlight, but she could feel the pressure lifting. The wall of hate and indifference was cracking. She took a breath, and this time, her breath didn't shake. She felt a sudden rush of power. It wasn't the power of a queen or a rich businessman. It was the power of truth. She was telling them who she was through the music, and they were finally starting to hear her. She played a run of notes that went up the keyboard and then tumbled back down, like a waterfall. It was technically difficult. Her fingers moved so fast they were almost a blur. A gasp went through the front row. It wasn't a loud gasp, but a collective intake of breath. Even the people who didn't know anything about music could tell that moving your fingers that fast, that smoothly, was hard to do. The waiter by the pillar shifted his weight. He realized he had been standing there for a long time. He looked around and saw that other people were watching the stage too. The spell was spreading. The music was like a vine, growing quickly, wrapping around the room, squeezing out the noise and the arrogance. Elena's face was still calm, but her eyes were bright. She was no longer the shy teacher in a blue dress. She was a musician. The piano was no longer a monster, it was her partner. They were working together to cast a spell over this rude, fancy crowd. The notes flowed out of the piano, not just as sound, but as emotion. It was the sound of loneliness, and then the sound of hope. It was the sound of someone working hard and finally being seen. The silence that the outline promised was starting to fall, but it wasn't total yet. There were still clinking glasses in the back. There were still people whispering. But the mocking was gone. The feeling in the room had flipped. The people who had been looking down on her were now looking up. They were leaning forward in their seats. They were trying to figure out where this music was going. They were hooked. The humble beginning had tricked them, and now they were caught in the net of her song. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with electricity. Everyone could feel that something special was happening on that stage, something that didn't happen often at these fancy parties. The soft, tricky melody that Elena had been playing suddenly changed. It was as if a gentle wind had turned into a storm. Without warning, her left hand came down hard on the lower keys. A deep, booming sound filled the entire hall. It vibrated through the floorboards, up the legs of the tables, and right into the chests of the people sitting in the front row. The sound was so strong that you could feel it in your teeth. This was no longer a whisper. This was a shout. The effect on the room was immediate and shocking. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The loud conversations that had been filling the air just a second ago were cut off instantly. A man near the front was in the middle of saying something rude about the food, but the sound from the piano swallowed his words. He stopped talking, his mouth hanging half open. The low, rumbling notes from the piano commanded respect. They were too powerful to ignore. Elena's body changed, too. The shy, nervous woman who had walked onto the stage seemed to disappear. She leaned into the piano. Her posture became strong and aggressive. She wasn't just pressing keys anymore, she was attacking them, but with love and control. Her right hand began to fly across the high keys, playing a fast, complicated pattern of notes that sounded like rain pouring down on a tin roof. It was technically difficult music. The kind of music that professionals practice for years. Her fingers moved so fast that they looked like a blur. A young man in the back, who had been laughing only moments ago, stared with his eyes wide. He elbowed his friend hard in the ribs, not to make a joke, but to point. His friend looked up, and his face went blank. They both realized, at the same time, that this amateur was playing better than anyone they had ever heard live. The silence in the room grew heavy. It wasn't a quiet, empty silence anymore. It was a tense, electric silence. It was the feeling you get when you watch a tightrope walker stepping out over a deep canyon. Everyone was holding their breath. They were afraid that if they made a sound, the magic would break. The woman with the diamond necklace slowly lowered her hand. She had been fiddling with her jewelry, but now she was perfectly still. Her expensive earrings dangled, but she didn't move a muscle. The music was demanding her full attention. It was stripping away her boredom and her arrogance. The melody was sad and angry at the same time. It sounded like a person crying out from a lonely place. It was a raw, human sound that cut through all the fake smiles and expensive clothes. For the first time all night, the woman felt something real. She felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know why, but the music made her want to cry. On stage, Elena was sweating. A drop of perspiration rolled down her temple, but she didn't wipe it away. She was lost in the song. She wasn't thinking about the crowd anymore. She wasn't thinking about their money or their judgment. She was thinking about the music. She was thinking about every hard day she ever had, every time she felt invisible, and every time she sat at a piano and found peace. She was pouring all of that life experience into the instrument. The piano was taking her pain and turning it into something beautiful. The song reached a point where the rhythm became frantic. The bass notes were pounding like a heartbeat, and the melody was soaring high above them. It was chaotic but controlled. It was like a storm that you know will pass, but right now, it is scary and exciting. The critic in the back stood up. He didn't mean to, his body just reacted. He needed to see better. He squinted, trying to understand how this woman was creating such a huge sound. He saw her simple blue dress, her worn-out shoes, and her intense face. It didn't make sense to his logical brain. How could someone with so little status have so much talent? He pulled out his notebook, but he didn't write anything. He just stood there, captivated. Waiters froze in their tracks. The man holding the silver tray had completely forgotten his job. He was standing near a pillar, his mouth slightly open, watching Elena's hands. He wasn't a music expert, but he knew what hard work looked like. He knew what passion looked like. And he was seeing it right there. The music made him think of his own dreams, the things he had given up on. It made him feel emotional in a room full of strangers. The contrast was incredible. Just 10 minutes ago, this room was a cold, noisy place filled with people who didn't care about anyone but themselves. Now, because of one woman and her piano, the room had transformed. The music had united them. It didn't matter who was rich and who was a waiter. They were all just listeners now. Elena's foot pressed down on the sustain pedal, holding a chord that seemed to last forever. The sound was rich and full, filling every corner of the high ceiling. The vibration was so strong that the water in the glasses on the tables was actually rippling. People looked down at their water glasses in wonder. The mocking voices from earlier were completely gone. No one was whispering. No one was checking their phones. The hundreds of people in the hall were reduced to silence by the power of the performance. The woman they had laughed at for her dress was now the queen of the room. She owned them. She controlled their emotions with just her 10 fingers. The music began to build toward its highest point. The notes got faster and higher. It felt like the song was climbing a mountain, straining to reach the very top. The tension in the room was unbearable. People were leaning so far forward in their seats that they were almost falling out. The air felt thick with anticipation. Elena's face was fierce. She was not smiling. She was serious and focused. She was pouring every ounce of her energy into the piano. The sound was deafening now, but it wasn't painful noise. It was a glorious, overwhelming wave of sound. It washed away the prejudice, the judgment, and the snobbery. There was no high class or low class anymore. There was only the music. She hit a series of chords that were like thunder. The sound shook the stage. And then, suddenly, she changed the rhythm. She slowed it down. The chaos turned into order. The noise began to settle, like dust after an explosion. She was leading them toward the end, but she wasn't there yet. She held them on the edge of their seats, making them wait for the final release, playing with their emotions, making them feel exactly what she wanted them to feel. The room was so quiet now that you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. But no one cared about that, all they could hear was the song. The silence was a sign of respect. It was the loudest silence Elena had ever heard. She had won. The music had been building up like a wave rising higher and higher in the ocean, and finally, it was time for that wave to crash. Elena's hands moved faster than they had all night. The sound coming from the piano was huge and powerful, filling every corner of the giant hall. It felt like the roof might shake. The notes were rushing down like a waterfall, loud and intense. And then, with a sudden, confident motion, Elena slammed her hands down on the final chord. She didn't lift her hands immediately. She held them down on the keys, letting the sound ring out. It was a massive, beautiful sound that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy cloud. The vibration of the strings shook through the floor and into the feet of everyone in the room. Then, she lifted her hands off the keys. For the first few seconds, there was absolute silence. It was a heavy, thick silence. No one spoke. No one moved. You couldn't even hear anyone breathing. It was as if the entire room had been frozen in time. The sound of the piano faded away slowly, echoing up into the high ceilings, but the feeling of the music stayed. The people in the crowd were stunned. Their brains were trying to catch up with what their ears had just heard. The man near the front, who had been making fun of her blue dress, sat with his mouth slightly open. His glass of champagne was forgotten in his hand. He was looking at the stage, but he wasn't seeing the simple woman, he was seeing the power of what she had just done. He felt a sudden hot feeling of shame in his chest. He realized he had been judging a book by its cover, and he had been completely wrong. The silence lasted for 3 long seconds. It felt like a lifetime. Then, a sound broke the quiet. It wasn't a cough or a whisper. It was the sound of 2 hands slapping together hard. It was the waiter standing by the pillar. He didn't care if he wasn't supposed to make noise. He just started clapping. He clapped loudly and with a huge smile on his face. He was clapping for the music, and he was clapping for the triumph of a regular person doing something extraordinary. That single sound was like a spark in a dry forest. Suddenly, the whole room erupted. It wasn't just polite clapping. It wasn't the kind of quiet applause people give when they are bored. It was a roar. It started with the people in the front who had seen the emotion on Elena's face up close. They jumped to their feet. Then the people behind them stood up. Then the people in the back. Within moments, the entire hall was on its feet. The noise was deafening. It was louder than the party chatter had been earlier, but this noise was full of respect and amazement. People were whistling and shouting bravo. Some people were wiping tears from their eyes without even realizing it. The music had touched something inside them that their expensive food and flashy clothes could never touch. It had reminded them what it felt like to be human. The woman with the diamond necklace was clapping so hard her hands were turning red. She wasn't looking at her phone anymore. She wasn't looking at her friends. She was staring at Elena, trying to understand how this woman, whom she had ignored completely, had such a massive gift inside her. The arrogance had vanished from her face, replaced by awe. On the stage, Elena sat frozen for a moment. The bright lights were still shining in her eyes, so she couldn't see the crowd clearly, but she could hear them. She could feel the energy coming at her like a physical force. It washed over her, warm and welcoming. Her heart was beating so fast she thought it might jump out of her chest. She had done it. She had played her heart out, and they had listened. Slowly, she stood up. She looked small and fragile standing in front of the massive black piano, especially compared to the grand, fancy room. But as she turned to face the crowd, she looked different. Her shyness was still there, but it was mixed with a quiet dignity. She didn't look like the victim anymore. She looked like a victor. She gave a small, shy smile. She didn't bow like a famous movie star with a flourish. She just nodded her head slightly and bent at the waist. It was a humble bow. It was the bow of someone who was grateful for the chance to be heard, not someone who demanded attention. The applause got even louder when she bowed. People were screaming now. It was a rock concert atmosphere. The critic in the back was still standing, clapping with a slow, rhythmic beat. He knew he would have to write a completely different story for the newspaper tomorrow. He wasn't writing about a substitute anymore. He was writing about a star who was born in a blue dress. Elena didn't stay to soak in the praise. She didn't wait for the organizers to come out and give her flowers or a trophy. She didn't want to give a speech. She had said everything she needed to say with the piano. She gave one last, quick nod to the audience, turned around, and walked quickly off the stage. As she disappeared behind the heavy red curtains, the applause didn't stop. It kept going for a long time. People wanted her to come back out. They wanted an encore. They wanted to hear more. But Elena was gone. She was walking down the long, dark hallway backstage, her hands still trembling. She leaned against a wall and took a deep breath, letting the adrenaline rush through her body. She felt tired, but she felt incredibly alive. Back in the hall, the crowd slowly started to sit down. The mood in the room had changed completely. The air didn't feel fake and cold anymore. It felt warm and excited. Groups of people started talking, but the conversation was different now. They weren't bragging about their stock market wins or their vacation homes. "Did you see her hands?" one man whispered, still shaking his head in disbelief. "I have never seen anyone move that fast. I was ready to leave early, his friend admitted, looking a bit embarrassed. "I'm so glad I stayed. It was magical. I don't even know how to describe it." The woman with the diamonds was talking to her husband. "We need to find out who she is," she said insistently. "Does she have an album? I want to hire her for my next party." "No, wait, I want to just hear her play again." It was so moving. Even the young people in the back, who had been so rude earlier, were quiet. They looked a bit sheepish. "Okay," one of them mumbled. "She was actually really good. Like, really good." As the night went on and the gala started to wind down, people left the hall. But they didn't leave talking about the decorations or the food. They left talking about the music. They left talking about the woman in the simple blue dress who had silenced them all. The story of that night spread quickly through the city. It became a legend. People talked about how the room went from mocking to silence to thunderous applause in the span of 10 minutes. It became a lesson about judging people based on how they look. For Elena, life went back to normal. She went back to her small apartment. She went back to teaching her students. But something was different. When she sat down at her own old piano to practice, she played with a new confidence. She knew now that her voice mattered. She knew that true talent doesn't need a fancy dress or a rich audience to be powerful. It just needs to be real. The grand hall was empty now. The cleaners were sweeping up the confetti and the empty champagne glasses. The lights were dimmed. But the piano was still there on the stage, shining in the dark. It looked like a sleeping beast, resting after a great battle. And if you listened very closely in the empty room, you could almost still hear the ghost of her final chord, hanging in the air, reminding everyone that real beauty is often found in the humblest of places. The crowd had come for a show, but they left with a memory that would change them forever.